Okay, hello everyone. I'm really happy that we are starting the ninth session of our cognitive neuroscience course from basic foundation to pragmatic and clinical applications. And today I'm going to talk about prefrontal cortex and decision making and how prefrontal cortex is managing complex cognitive functions. And from the first part of the session, we are going to talk about, first of all, giving an evolutionary perspective about prefrontal cortex and prefrontal cortex functions. So we'll start from this point. You probably have heard that using tools is a really important step in the process of evolution. And there are just very limited numbers of animals that are able to use tools to perform specific functions. And there is a question from the neuroscience perspective, why developing tools and using different sort of tools is so important in the process of evolution and is so complex that just limited numbers of animals are able to use tools, and why using tools is going to be such an important topic for cognitive neuroscience and evolutionary neuroscience. And I'm going to talk about this issue and discuss about why using tools is such an important brain function. And it is not as simple as it seems in the first place. It is a really complex process in the brain, and it is related to many aspects of brain development. So we will discuss about these issues in the first part of the class today. And from this part, we will move forward to have a better understanding about other brain functions that are related to this kind of really fundamental aspects of human evolution and whatever we have in the process of evolution. So we know that different animals and human beings, they have different sizes of the brain, and we have, let's say, similar structures in many aspects, even from kind of rat to cat to chimpanzee to human. And there are some specific variation as well. For example, it's quite interesting that in dolphins, we have a significant development in the parietal cortex. So it seems that the parietal cortex that is important for navigation and processing different things that are related to navigation is so well developed in dolphins. But other than this specific kind of unique characteristics among dolphins, one of the really important aspects of kind of the evolutionary pathway for brain is that we know that the brain among kind of the different species that are related to humans has been in the process of development, and it changes in the size over time. And we had a significant change from what we called Homo habilis that goes back something like 2 million years ago to what we already have that we called Homo sapiens, or Homo sapiens neanderthalis and Homo sapiens sapiens. So this kind of group of people that we call mainly Homo sapiens, from something like 500 centimeter cubical to something like 1,500 centimeter cubical. And there is a question whether what this, let's say, 1,000 centimeter cubical is adding to the cognitive functions, and why we have such a really big step in this process from Homo habilis to Homo erectus and then Homo sapiens, and what this really large part of the brain is adding to what we know about brain processes and brain cognition. One really important aspect of this development, if you just review the size of different parts of the skull, you can obviously see that there is a significant increase in the frontal part of the skull. So you can see that the change in the angle of the skull in the front part towards something like a perpendicular that we already have in humans, from something that was something like in the kind of the horizontal angle. And that is an interesting evolutionary process in the skull and in the brain that is basically driving the evolution in the skull as well. If you just see the percent of the skull that is being occupied by what we call prefrontal cortex, it is something like 3% in cat. But when we go for human being, it goes to something like 30%. So something like 30% of the skull is filled with what we call prefrontal cortex. And that is amazing how in the process of development, we have larger and larger and larger prefrontal cortex. And the question is why? Why we do need such a large prefrontal cortex among human beings? And what is the specific function for prefrontal cortex to be such a huge organ within something like a really limited space in the brain? And the skull is a really well-developed structure to protect whatever we have in the brain, and every single centimeter of extra size would make a huge amount of cost for the organism or for the agent, because it is so hard to maintain, and it is so hard to also keep it as something that is going to remain safe within the skull. But why, with this huge amount of cost to have a kind of a larger prefrontal cortex, we needed that so badly that we invested hugely on developing prefrontal cortex. And it's amazing that even when we see and compare the structure with the most advanced monkeys like chimpanzees and human, we can see that the general structure is quite similar. So we have most of those, let's say, Brodmann structures in both monkeys and humans, and we can even compare some of these structures to each other in terms of, let's say, Brodmann area number 10 in the frontopolar areas, and then different areas that we have. But as you can see here, there are a little bit of variations in these parts that we have, that we discussed about, that are really important in terms of the language. But there are still some kind of aspects of what we have in terms of the prefrontal cortex in monkeys. But as you can see, in terms of the evolution, we have such a huge prefrontal cortex in human being. And I will discuss about what are the implications of having such a huge prefrontal cortex, and the really important functions are related to this part of the brain. During last sessions, we have discussed that one of the important part of the evolution of brain and nervous system in human being is having better connectivity within different areas in the brain. So we discussed that in monkeys we still have these connections, but the real good combination between, let's say, prefrontal cortical functions with what we have in the parietal area, what we have in the temporal areas, from the what pathway or let's say where or how pathways. These parts are only in human beings that are well connected. So one aspect of the development is how these areas are getting well connected. But other than discussing about the connection and how these parts of the brain are connected, as you can see here, these are the parts that we have discussed about before in terms of the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex that we named as, we provided another name for ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Could you tell me the name in the chat box? What was the name of the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex? Good, that is true. Yeah, inferior frontal gyrus. So we have discussed about that before, inferior frontal gyrus. And then ventral premotor area, anterior inferior frontal. So those areas that we have discussed about before. And probably in the first classes, you had problems in terms of understanding these names, but I hope that now you have a better understanding. And with all those exercises and brain atlases that we have explored so far, you have developed a sort of a level of skill to be able to navigate around these names without having significant problems in understanding how they are located in different parts of the brain. So we discussed about the connections, but other than connection, what is the role of this part here? What this part of the brain is working, and why we have such a huge kind of prefrontal cortex, other than connections that we discussed about before. I'm going to be back to what we have discussed about the tools and why tools are important and what do we mean by tools and why tools are significantly critical for what we have in the process of evolution. If I just make a kind of a figure from the brain, and as we discussed, this is what we have in the, let's say, this is what we have in motor cortex, this is what we have in the sensory cortex, and we discussed about other aspects, something like inferior frontal gyrus, and the other aspects of the prefrontal cortex. So we discussed about dorsolateral prefrontal cortex or other parts. So this is the anterior part, this is the posterior part. It seems that when we have tools, it means that we have a proactive mental representation of actions. And what do we mean by proactive mental representation of actions? Why do we mean with this combination? Why being proactive is important? Why actions could be represented in a proactive way when we want to use tools? First of all, it's really important to think that when we are picking a stick as a tool to go to somewhere and find something like ants that are going to be collected from a hole in a tree, or just finding a place to, let's say, harvest honey in